Nick, to me, this film was obviously very grim, and I also felt very sad watching the film, but also a sense of anger at the state. To me, it seemed like a film that completely exemplified the ideological state apparatus, the state and the press in being complicit to repression. And also the state of America as the country that was telling the rest of the world what is good and what is evil and so on. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions from the audience about the continuing political repression of the marginalized in terms of race and gender. But I have a slightly different question to you, because you've made another film about a serial killer, and that was a woman and the victims were men. And now we have a film here about a male serial killer and the victims are women. And what is it about killing that fascinates you?
Well, that's such a big question. I mean, there's so many questions there. I think your statements about, America and the rest of the world and so on are completely correct. I mean, I think very subjectively for me as a filmmaker doing this film, I thought the thing I took away from it was that the people in it were fantastic. They were just really wonderful people who continuously surprised me. People like, I thought Pam was magical, and you could have just made a film about her philosophy driving around the streets of South Central, and she constantly came up with things that surprised me. And I think personally what I took from it was, I thought, my God, I have such a privileged life, and I feel so sorry for myself sometimes. And these people are just unbelievable, the way they carry on and they do their things, and they have such a kind of almost optimistic way of dealing with reality. So that's personally kind of what I took from it. I know it's about a very grim subject, and I know the kind of conclusion you get about the American political system and its feelings towards disposable people is, obviously very depressing and sad. But I think, it was surprisingly a very enjoyable film to make. I made, a lot of films, and certainly, Pam and Margaret Prescott from the Black Coalition and Nana Gyamfi are people I think I'll probably have as friends for life, so that's a lot of people in one film, so.
No, obviously the women were absolutely brilliant, and all the women, right from the first woman we hear, the mother, to the activist, to the prostitute, to the victims in the end, and I think they will stay on forever in our minds. How did you find these characters? How did you go about finding these characters and deciding these were the characters who are going to kind of enliven the whole film for?
Well, I think, when you make these kinds of films, the characters just come to you. And we met, I remember the first day, which you see in the film, which is when they were calling me Peckerwood and stuff. We met a lot of people because, we kind of, in a way, parachuted in, and the whole street was out. And some people just sort of stuck. When I met the three friends of Lorne's that we called the Three Stooges, I just knew that they were going to be characters, enduring characters in the film. And I knew that they were full of contradictions, and I knew they knew lots of things that they weren't saying, and I knew that they would, in a way, pay off, which they did. And we met Pam pretty early on as well. And I think because because they're street people, they're just so articulate. They're used to telling stories. They're used to surviving on their wit. They don't spend the day on computers like the rest of us. And I think they are, because of that, much more articulate probably than most of us are. So they're great storytellers, and they're amazing people to have in a film.
Yeah, I agree with you. They may be great storytellers, but I think it's also because of you And because, if I just move on to the craft of documentary filmmaking, I think one of the most important things is interviews. And I've seen that you have a range of interviews in your filmography, some interviews which are really hilarious, not in this film, but you have it, and some which are so deep and so moving. And it's, yes, they are articulate, but I think it's also the way you conduct interviews. And can you elaborate something about that?
Well, I mean, someone like Pam, you don't have to ask a lot of questions, really, because she's got I think with most of the people in this film, in this particular film, people just had a story they wanted to tell. They'd probably never been asked to tell the story before, and that you didn't, in some films you have to find, or you have to really study the characters and work out which words almost act as a trigger to open them up, and to, it's hard to open people up sometimes. But in this film, I found people really wanted to talk. They really wanted to tell their story, and I had to do very little. I could be pretty lazy, and they would just tell me amazing things. I constantly was surprised. I'd sort of, because sometimes we did quite formal interviews, which I don't normally do. And I'd barely ask one question, and just this incredible story would come out, and I'd be completely amazed, because normally you have to really work for it, but that didn't happen here.
What about editing? Because most documentaries are made on the editing table, and did you have to make tough decisions on editing? Also, you're known as an observational filmmaker, and you're a student of Colin Young, and you're an admirer of Wiseman.
Yeah.
But I noticed a lot of jump cuts in the interviews, and why did you use jump cuts? And also the music that you have used, and can you talk something about editing and music?
Yeah, well, I think the editing on this film was interesting. I've normally had a much stronger hand in the editing of the films, but I ended up working with someone called Joe Beanie, who mainly cuts for Herzog, and has cut all his well-known documentaries. And because we were also still filming when the editing was happening, Joe made a lot of the selections on the film. And Joe, I don't like using cutaways at all, which is very much actually what Colin Young would teach. It's, I think, part of the whole dogma thing, which borrowed all the rules from observational cinema or ethnographic filmmaking, is that you don't use cutaways. So you obviously use jump cuts. And Joe had just jump cut all the way through the film. And although Joe actually partway through, after about 4 months, had to go off and do Herzog's next film, which was in Morocco. So we lost him, and then I cut the rest of it with Mark Hofflin. And, we changed it obviously somewhat, and also we were shooting more material. But I think a lot of the initial decisions were really made by Joe, particularly in the selection. We kind of kept with it. And I liked his editing style, which is probably more juddery than I normally go for. But I thought it was appropriate for this film. And the music was with Scott Salinas, who was a composer I'd never worked with before. But I thought was really pretty amazing. He's done a lot of scores now on documentaries. He works a lot with, I think he might have done Man on Wire, and he's done a lot of big documentaries. And he's, very easy to work with. And some composers are not so easy to work with, but he was very open for lots of different things. And it took him a while to get it right. I think he was one of those composers that just tries and tries and tries until he gets it right. I've worked with other composers who start getting really shirty after you've sent it back about 8 times. And then, once someone becomes defensive. I mean, the thing about films is they're such a collaborative thing, and you have to find a way of keeping people liking you if possible, because there are many occasions when people are under a lot of pressure, and no one likes doing something 10 times, but sometimes if something's not right, you just have to send it back. And Scott was really pretty amazing about that. He was very good-natured, and I'd definitely work with him again. And we had a bit of a guide track on some of them. There was actually the main thing is actually from Vertigo, which was a Hitchcock's score, which originally we tried to buy, but I think could probably cost as much as the film. So you then have to go that sort of excruciating thing of changing enough notes that you can't be done for plagiarism, but you keep the same feeling of it.
Before I throw it open to the audience, one last question. I mean, you were this English gent. I'm sure you looked very prominent in the streets, rough parts of LA, walking around with your high-end camera and your sound gear and everything.
Yeah.
Didn't you? I mean, was it safe? And we heard gunshots in between, and you had your son with you. Was it a safe environment for you to be there? And were you scared at all at any point?
It was funny. I didn't feel scared from the beginning, even when they were shouting Peckerwood and I'll cap your ass and all that stuff, because I know they didn't really mean it. But the DP I had started with, who had done a couple of sort of, I did Ghosts with him and I did Battle of Editha with him, really got worried and asked to leave after 3 or 4 days. So I'd flown him all the way from England and I'd sent him back. And he had also, because he's a very big, strong guy and an ex-Wimbledon tennis player with very wide shoulders, he was like, oh, let's get an Alexa when we shoot this film, which is like this absurdly heavy camera to shoot a documentary with. So we had this enormous Alexa, and he then left, leaving me with this ridiculous camera. And my son had just come back. I don't know if you heard of a filmmaker called Hubert Soper. He's did a film called Darwin's Nightmare and just did this film called We Come as Friends, which was shot in Africa, which Barney, my son, had shot a lot of. So he'd come back from the Sudan. And so South Central was a bit like a walk in the park for him. And he was, I think, crippled after using the Alexa for a couple of weeks. And of course, he used it for months and months. But he's really, really good with people and making people feel relaxed, and which is half the thing of making a film. And so it worked out fantastically. In fact, one of the best things, really, in a way, on a personal level, was making the film with Barney, because it was such a pleasure working with him, and I think it was great for us, So it all sort of worked out very well, in the end. But I was obviously very nervous when so I wasn't frightened, but I think because there's so many myths about South Central and the dangers down there, people are unnecessarily worried and alarmed, and but I don't think it's really an unsafe place.
Anyone wants to start?
Hi. It's quite a broad question, but it's about the kind of ethics of making an oral history like this, where there are sort of internal and external forms of resistance to the telling of a given story, and how you kind of navigated that, sort of being an interloper in a community. And sort of asking those sorts of questions in that sort of a way. And I also noticed there's a kind of interesting parallel between, and obviously there's a parallel that ends at a very definite point, but between the crimes being committed by a man who's kind of cruising around looking for women, and you as a filmmaker in a car going around trying to find sort of women to give testimony. I wondered if that had come up in the film, in the making of the film, and if that's something you thought about at all.
Well, I think the way you, I think if it was just me and Barney cruising around, we would have obviously been doing exactly the same thing as Lonnie Franklin was doing. But of course, our saving grace was really having Pam. And I think that's just an example really of, you have to make a film in the way that it has to be made. You need the right person. Your approach is determined by exactly the needs of that situation. And each situation is different on each film. So although we'd initially started the film with somebody else who was also kind of from the neighborhood, that person had not worked on the streets and had not been on crack and wasn't somebody who was completely sort of authenticated in the way that Pam was, who knew half the people on the street. So half the challenge of making that kind of film is that you have somebody who can kind of be your guardian or your kind of key to the neighborhood, and that can be an awful lot of the work of the film, is finding that person. So the important thing, I think, when you're doing these films is you don't go in with a agenda or a sort of fixed idea of how you're going to do anything, because you really have no idea of what the problems are going to be that you will, and then you have to, you have to then find a way of embracing all those things. And the film comes out of that, really. It's like I had no idea really at all of the structure of the film when I went in. I knew what my general search was. I think it's useful in a film and in a story if you have a sort of investigation line, or you have a through line that's going to make an audience interested in it. It doesn't really even matter if it's more like a MacGuffin, but you need to have an ostensible through line. And then you pick the characters up as you go. Like, we met those three guys, we knew they were going to be characters, then shortly thereafter we met Pam. And of course you shoot a sequence like on the steps with them, and that's maybe your first like building block. It's your first, and you're going to return to it at some point. And so you have lots of kind of running stories, some of which pan out, some of which don't, some of which, the ones that pan out are kind of in the film, and the ones that aren't are on the, as they say, on the floor or elsewhere, but they don't end up in the film. And I guess in the editing room, you try and work out how you're going to put those stories together. At one point when Joe was editing the film, he felt that the film was also very much a battle between the sexes. That there was that Lonnie in a way represented the sexism that kind of ran through the whole community. So he had edited it much more like the man's story and the woman's story. And at one point, the end sequence with all the women telling their story was kind of in the middle of the film. That was sort of like the end of the women's story the way he constructed it. But then the whole film just sagged from there on in because it's obviously so powerful. So, a lot of what Mark and I did when we took over was to sort of restructure the story, make the investigation stronger, really, just sort through all the different storylines that we had.
I'm glad that you had this at the end, because the end is really very, very powerful. But surely, it must have been conscious, or was it unconscious, that the fact that you were driving the car, and there were some interviews that you didn't really have to do it through the window of the car, because you did see them afterwards in a room, and you were
No, they were different people, though. Yeah.
But it was like picking up some interviewees that you had, so I thought it was probably a conscious kind of.
Well, I think, yeah, we were sort of hunting around. And then, of course, Pam drove around a lot without us, you know, and found other people. But I don't think, I think that, you know, the women that we had at the end they weren't, none of them were the same that we met on the streets, yeah.
I was talking more about the men, I think, that you
Oh, the men.
picked up and you talked to them later on.
I think...
Including the guy who I think burned the car for insurance. We see him first through the window.
Oh, yeah,
So-
when we drove up to him.
then,
Yeah.
Can we?
Hi, thanks very much. Amazing film. I wanted to ask a question more generally about the sort of racist and misogynist undertones, overtones of the film. I'm from the music department and I teach on hip hop here. So obviously your films in the past have been important, but obviously a lot of the narratives here is things that concern me a lot. Obviously, one of the things that's really hard to get across to students in my classes here in this environment in Newcastle, the kind of students we have, is to try and reinforce a sense that, you know, that things haven't really changed or improved, or in fact probably actually got a lot worse since what we fable as the civil rights era, and, you know, things are supposed to be a lot better. So finding documentaries or any kind of, you know, pieces of work that bring this out is actually really hard. So this Stacey Peralta's film about the gang warfare, and also the House I Live In, which was a BBC Storyville thing a few years ago. And there's very rare glimpses that you get of this kind of legislation about drugs being actually very much kind of part of a very racial agenda. So seeing this, amazing, and great to see somebody tell another story that does that. How much of I mean, you talked at the beginning about the new Jim Crow and a writer, Michelle something I didn't catch.
Michelle Alexander.
Alexander.
Yeah.
For you making this film, how aware of it, how consciously how much of it was it part of your agenda to actually sort of engage in that kind of more general debate?
Well, you know, to be completely honest, I didn't really know that much going in, which I think sometimes is an advantage, particularly if you've got a long enough shooting schedule that you can learn as you go. So, and Nana Gyamfi, who's the lawyer who was dressed in the yellow t-shirt, she actually gives a class at USC, which is about racism and law. I had conversations with her, and I had a lot of conversations with Margaret Prescott, and they kind of educated me about really what was happening. And I met Michelle Alexander through Margaret Prescott. We went to one of her talks that she was doing. So those kinds of things I just learnt, and then they became very much a part of the film. So it wasn't that I went in with much of an agenda. I mean, I think filmmakers all work differently, and some go in, you know, very prepared with scripts and so on, but they probably don't do the kind of cruising around in the cars and stuff that I do, which frankly I probably enjoy more, or I think is more the kind of use of documentary that I like, because I feel that's where you get the unexpected stuff, and that's where you get the atmosphere, and that's where you and you have those magical moments that are just you don't get in any other filmmaking form, you know. So I tend to just like to learn as I go.
So what attracted you was just, as you said at the beginning, that there was this question to be asked. It wasn't any of that kind of greater narrative then?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, I'd obviously seen films like The House I Live In, and but I hadn't read any Michelle Alexander. I was, you know, kind of painfully unaware, I think, of the bigger significance of the story and how much it was related to what then erupted in Ferguson and has continued to happen. And that was kind of luck or zeitgeist or whatever, because it's part of the maelstrom that's going on at the moment in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, picking up on what you just said, how much research did you do into the topic before you actually started shooting film?
Well, what I tend to do is read whatever I can read. You know, there was a series of very good articles in the LA Weekly by someone called Christine Pelisek. She was a journalist who had actually told the community that there was a serial killer. She was the one who had worked that out in 2008. And she was the one who told a number of the families that their daughters had been killed by the serial killer. And she had written some good stuff, which I read. And then I think there was a piece in Newsweek. But I don't do sort of interviews with people before I start filming. And in fact, I tend to avoid even talking to them on the telephone. I would generally use a researcher or somebody or a producer or somebody to do that. Because I think that often your initial conversation with somebody is almost the most powerful. And I don't want to be one of those filmmakers who wants people to do it as well the second time as they did the first. You know, one of my rules is I don't get people to do things twice. It's kind of like you either get it or you don't get it. And I think that also keeps the sort of spontaneity going and so on. So, whereas I think a lot of other people call up, they sort of pre-interview people, they try and, you know, get as much of the story as they can and then structure it around interviews, fairly formal interviews. But that's just a style I don't normally operate in. The only reason I did formal interviews in this film was because a lot of the women didn't have homes, so you couldn't really film them in their homes. And the people who did have homes didn't want to be seen to be cooperating with a white film crew because of questions that might be asked within the community. So we ended up making our office kind of into a studio. And it's the only film I've done that in, but that was why there was more of a formality here.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I thought the film, you mentioned the maelstrom in the United States around race and those other issues, but I think the film also fits issues which are going on all over the place to do with the disposable or the marginalized or however we call them. Judith Butler wrote for her quite an approachable book called Frames of War, where she talked about grievable lives, the idea that the Western media says that a Western life is much more grievable, or it's worth more in terms of grieving than, say, an Islamic or a Middle Eastern life. And I wondered if this film, do you see it connected with an idea that you want to put on record the stories of the marginalised or the people who have been ignored or being invisible? And you mentioned Darwin's Nightmare, which is a film which does something a bit similar in terms of telling stories that are untold. Do you see that as important in your work and other people's work?
Well, yeah, I think the wonderful thing about documentary is that it can reach subjects that are not normally investigated or treated at all, and can humanize people that are normally written off. I mean, I think so many of my friends, for example, who live in Los Angeles, were just amazed how wonderful these people were. You know, oh my goodness, they're good looking and they're articulate. You know, they were really people who've grown up in Los Angeles, who've never been to South Central, who regard it as the kind of voodoo place you don't go to. So I think, you know, even amongst my friends, it sort of opened up their perception of that area. And I think it's all about giving people information that they don't have. I think so much prejudice is based on lack of information. And I think, you know, when people see people like Pam and others like that, who they really like, and they can laugh with them and so on, it creates a different change of perception. And I think that's something that is very attractive about documentary.
So just want to ask about the commissioning process. How much freedom did you have, and what constraints were put on you, if any?
Well, I was lucky on this, which is, Sky Atlantic, I think for the 2 weeks that I went in, had a potload of money, and they gave me a great dollop of it. I think they then shortly thereafter decided they made a dreadful mistake. They weren't giving out any budgets like the one they gave me. And then half the department got fired out of Sky. So all the original people I've been working with were fired. And I was in sort of blissful happiness all by myself, with nobody looking after me at all. So there weren't even any questions being asked at all. And in fact, the film was supposed to be finished a year and a bit before it was, because the trial kept being put back. And then when I kind of acquainted myself with Sky, which was probably to get some more money out of them, I think, I had a different group of people, but they were just completely accommodating and really, really easy to work with. I mean, they were, when I sent the final film in, I think there was, 2 notes, really nothing, and very supportive, very easy to work with,
Bazillion questions, really interesting film, and this might not be the best one to ask you, time running out, but I was really so surprised about how powerful the interview with the Sun was. How important was it that you got that interview with the Sun? And this might be impertinent, but was there any insights from the fact that you were working, and you mentioned yourself how important it was that you were working with your son on this film?
Oh, that I had my son on board. Well, I think it was oddly, at first, Barney, my son, and I decided we weren't going to really tell anyone that we were related. But Pam worked it out pretty quickly, because I guess you have sort of little tiffs with your son that you don't have with other people, and there's a sort of shorthand of annoyance or humor, which you share with someone you're really close to. So Pam got it pretty quickly and was, obviously highly amused. And then I think other people heard about it too. And I think, because Lonnie and Christopher obviously had such a close relationship, I think it was oddly reassuring to Christopher that we were. And he quite often called up for a while after the interview. He's since changed his phones, and I mean, one of the things that's difficult in that area is people change their phones about, every couple of months. So there's a lot of people I can't find anymore. And Christopher also moved, he moved to Vegas, and they sold the house. So we kind of I've lost touch with him now. But I think he was kind of reassured that we were kind of family. So I think it worked to our advantage in that way.
And that point about how important it was to get the interview with him, because
I felt it was very important, because I always thought he was probably the ultimate victim in a way. And also he's kind of a key, I think the little that he said, more with his face and his body, about his father was so revealing, and you could just feel, when he says, "What do you think?" at the end, I think it kind of, that was a real example of, the space between the words. And I thought he was, incredibly moving. I think, we all felt, pretty awful for him. And also, I guess you get a real sense of the father's guilt, and you ask questions about how much Christopher knew, and so all those kinds of things, which are all so much part of the story.
I wanted to ask you, you said you were driving around with a white crew in this black area, and the people know you after a while, like the English white crew driving around in the Mercedes interviewing.
In a big black Mercedes, yeah. I think they yes.
Pam, like as an entrance, because she then always said, "Oh, it's my English friends."
Well, yeah, she was pretty amazing. I think driving around the neighborhood, just the two of us, would have been pretty counterproductive, I think. And yeah, we did become obviously pretty well known because we were in a distinctive car, and we were probably the only two white faces driving around. Normally it is, either the police or the FBI or something who would be doing that. But they would probably be in a Crown Victoria rather than a Mercedes. They all have the same cars. So it was, I don't know, I think within Lonnie's street, people were very protective of Lonnie. And, the few times we got into trouble was people got really upset if we filmed the outside of his house, for example. I think people were very protective to Christopher and the mother, or Christopher's mother, Lonnie's wife, who was living more in the house now that Lonnie was arrested than she had before. And there was, I guess, an initial suspicion, but that sort of, we were there for so long that I think it kind of went,
Hi. A lot of your male characters, obviously, they did seem like they knew a lot more than they let on, and that kind of paced out through the film, which was great. But I was just wondering, kind of, the urge to challenge what they were kind of saying, whether it's through the pictures that they revealed, things like that. Did you want to kind of delve deeper into what did they know?
What would you have asked?
I guess I want to know where you were involved.
What, in the murders?
Yeah.
Well, they all kind of said they weren't involved in the murders, and I actually believed them. I think, I suppose the one who was the least who was the most likely to be involved was Jerry, the one with the teeth missing. But I actually believed him too when he said, I was on crack and I watched him torture them. But because he was so honest, I was amazed, frankly, with what he told me. I felt that they were all, one of the reasons they were talking was because I think they were kind of worried about how close they'd been to these murders, and it was sitting badly with them. I think they liked Lonnie, but wanted to distance themselves, I think, from the killings and indicate that they weren't a part of it. I think that was their main thing. But obviously, they were a part of this sort of... If you live in an area that's just completely dominated by crack cocaine, the whole way of behaving is different from, a normal community. There are people freaking out, running down the road with virtually no clothes on. So they get used to a different kind of thing happening, and a lot of the more beautiful women are selling their bodies on the street. So that does really change the whole fundamental relationship between men and women in that area, and it breaks all the families up. And so the behavior of men often I think in those areas is very different from elsewhere, and one of the things that happens when you make a film is it makes people much more introspective than normal, because you're kind of asking them questions about things they probably tend not to want to think about. So I think that, they were coming forward and saying things that they probably were thinking more about because of the film. And I actually believed them too. I thought that I didn't feel there was any need either to confront them, because I felt that they were coming forward. I didn't think I needed to show any... I think one of the things is when you make these kinds of films, you can't start showing disapproval or moral judge, I morally disapprove of what you're doing, because that's kind of not really what you're there for. It's more to enable them to say things. And
it shuts them up too, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you come across like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
they wouldn't talk to you after that.
yeah, exactly. And you want their humanity to come through as well. And I think to a certain extent you do get a sense of their contradictions, and they're not, people aren't just all bad. There's always, and part of it is you want to get all those grey areas out. You want to get, isn't it? You want to get the complexity of their characters.
I like the fact that you did mention that they're kind of within the kind of the various storylines and various like MacGuffins, and thinking about some of the things like the law court scenes in a way. Or there's a few areas where, or for example, where you go to you kind of meet the waste disposal people. So you go, there are certain places where you go, but actually in a way it's not the same as the human story, which kind of comes through those characters.
Yeah.
So that sense, and possibly that there's a kind of a bigger system, the police, possible corruption or knowledge of the police, what the police may have known, in a way is possibly, it could have been an opening, but there's a sense in which actually the human story comes through.
Well, I guess too that the police complete lack of cooperation forced us probably to make a much better film than we would have done had they been really cooperative, or had the coroner's office wanted to talk to us, or any of the detectives, or they were just, it was impossible to get any kind of official cooperation. So I think in a way that was a story that most people would tell. It was a story that Christine Pelisek in her articles told, for example. So there was a lot about what the police had said or what the investigation had produced. There was very little about the people in the community and how it kind of happened within the community.
I was just wondering about the effects of the film, and first of all, like whether the police have actually picked up on any of the interviews that you interviewed and interviewed them properly about the case. And secondly, as well, I was kind of interested in what you were saying about friends in LA, kind of opening up people's eyes about the South Central area, but also kind of wondered if it's like if any kind of just sort of feminist women's rights groups have kind of picked it up as a kind of broader issue that isn't sort of race specific.
Yeah, well, yes, they certainly have. Margaret Prescott has used the film a lot with women's groups specifically, and many black women's groups. So that's one of the really good outcomes of the film, that it has been used a lot in local screenings and that kind of thing. But I've forgotten your first question.
Whether the police have picked up on any of the
No, the police really didn't. I mean, the police, I think, are completely consistent, which is they feel they've now got their case, which is based on DNA and ballistics. They're not asking any questions really about where the other women are, or they're kind of saying, well, they're all in landfill, but there's no real. I think when you have a community like South Central, which is completely disenfranchised, that has no real political system to support it, where there aren't any, the few black politicians that have been elected from there are not supported financially by the community because it's so disorganized. They all end up working for like the teachers union or the police federation, for example. And so there's no one really pressuring the police to come up with results. So they're simply not investigating those things. They hadn't even spoken to Jerry, the guy who said he knew half the victims. And I don't think they feel there's any pressure on them to have to do that. I mean, there was only really Margaret Prescott and the Black Coalition. And, one of the things that was supposed to happen with the film was that they were going to attend a meeting with Charlie Beck, who's a police chief, with the mayor, and with various other people from the city. And in the last minute, they cancelled it. So, in fact, it never happened, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, considering it's like a women's rights issue, you would think there would be more wealthy, well-placed women in in LA to kind of pressure on the police department, you know, to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the racism in the States goes pretty deep. I mean, the woman who did the vagina monologues was going to put some money, and I think she's friends with Margaret. And there's also a charity down there called A Better Life, which pays for a lot of women who come out of prison who are on crack to go through a program. But there's really very little. And, you know, there has never really been, for example, a program to systematically eradicate crack from that area, or to deal with the crack as a community problem rather than an individual problem. None of that happens, you know, and I think, you know, that it's just the way the political system works there.
What's the situation with Franklin now?
Well, I think the trial has just been postponed a bit longer, so it's now going to be October or November.
One of the things that shocked me was that you could keep somebody in jail for 4 years, effectively, you know, without, you know, the fact he hasn't been found guilty, so he's technically still innocent. And you
Yeah.
give somebody of the liberty.
Well, it's mainly been his lawyers who have postponed the trial, yeah. Well, the defense tends to do that because it's, you know, more witnesses die off, or more family members die off, or the police lose more evidence. So it's always, you know, to the advantage of the defense to prolong it. And also, you know, it's much more comfortable for him being in the jail in downtown LA where his family can come visit him and stuff than being stuck out in San Quentin on death row, you know, so.
Thanks very much, Nick, for Phil and comments. You said you do what research you can do, and I think you said you sort of parachute yourself in there. Is there any anxiety as you do that about, am I going to get a film here? And is there a moment that you know in this film that I do have a story to tell? And was it the story you thought you were going to tell when you started out?
Well, I think the filmmaker's nightmare is always, do I have a story? And I think that goes right the way through the film. And it's kind of the thing that propels you forward. And so you're constantly, as a storyteller, trying to make sure you've got a story and constantly examining who your main characters are and how their story is developing and whether you're, in fact, catching that development. And that's your obsession during the whole of the filming, really. And, you know, in a way, it's a pleasurable obsession because you're so enveloped in the characters and you just live and breathe it, I think. And, you know, I wasn't sure whether, on this film, whether we needed the trial and the outcome of the trial to really have enough of a resolution. So when Joe Beanie started cutting it, it was to see whether or not we had enough of the story without the trial. You know, that was one of the kind of few conversations I had with Sky, which was, I'm going to try and cut something without the trial having happened. And then you don't really know until you've got a... I mean, I think we knew that it was we had really strong stuff. But you don't really know until you get going. Because also, I'm not one of those filmmakers who watches my rushes. Because I find it so painful that it kind of makes me completely crazy. You know, and I prefer to concentrate on what I'm going to do tomorrow rather than looking at all the mistakes I made yesterday. So, and then you kind of forget what you've got, you know. And so it's only when you watch all your rushes that you kind of remember, actually I got this and I got that, and which you kind of don't necessarily remember.
I'm just told we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, yourself and then yourself.
I just wanted to sort of follow up something you asked earlier or referred to, which was the 2 films that you made about the Amy Warnos case.
Right.
And this is very different, obviously, because it's focusing much more on the victims than on the killers. And I just wondered if you could say something about the comparison between the 2. And also, I was intrigued, following on from what the last questioner said, about the brief glimpse that we did get of the sort of trial and the behaviour of Lonnie's lawyer,
right,
in particular.
Lonnie's lawyer, I will answer the Eileen question, but Lonnie's lawyer was a hilarious character, and I didn't really do him justice in the film. I mean, there were so many stories in this film, and one of them was definitely Seymour, the lawyer, who came from a family who were in vaudeville. And so, his idea of going to court was to be as entertaining and ridiculous as possible, and to upset as many people as possible. And he and the DA really hated each other. They'd been friends at one point, and Beth Silverman, the DA, had upset Seymour by insulting Seymour's daughter. And so it was war between them. And he just did as many things to drive her crazy in all the court appearances as possible. So it was pretty entertaining in the court, but it, of course, didn't really advance the case very much. And the judge was always trying to separate these two kids in the schoolyard, who were just trying to cause each other pain. These films are very different because I think as a filmmaker you tend to follow your heart, and the thing that moves you is the thing that you make the film about. And there was something about Eileen that I really loved. I thought she was, she was like a lost kid who had constantly made the wrong choices in life. She was completely consistent in that. Even her choice of lawyer and her born-again Christian mother and, one thing after another, Eileen always consistently made the wrong choice. And I actually tried to get her a different lawyer. There was a very talented group of women, New York lawyers, who I think could have done something for Eileen, but she managed to fall out with them and, return to Steve and Arlene Prawley. And she definitely kind of lost her mind increasingly. So by the time I met her again in the second film, she was, she'd really kind of lost it. She thought her mind was being controlled by radio waves and all that kind of stuff. So, she was an example of somebody who I think was incredibly let down by the system, by, completely vindictive, eye for an eye kind of system, with Jeb Bush dying to execute her before he was going to be, it was going to help his re-election bid. So that was kind of that story. And I didn't really feel anything for Lonnie at all.
Was there the same kind of media circus around him as there was around her conviction and trials?
Yeah, maybe she had a bigger one. I think she was like the witch that was going to be burnt at the stake. So there was a really big media circus around her. I think her story in a way was more sensational. It was about white middle-class men being killed by a white serial, America's first female serial killer. So that was a much more sellable story than black crack prostitutes being killed by a black serial killer, which is a kind of non-story. So, which wasn't going to sell any newspaper. So it just simply wasn't reported in the LA Times or local media.
Well, men's life matter more than women's life. I mean, that's all there is to that.
That's true.
Yes.
So I was going to ask just very basically how you deal with your own emotions, because sort of having watched your career over the last 40 years, looking at films like The Leader, The Driver, The Driver's Wife, where you dealt with racism there, and you seem to grow quite attached to the people in the documentary, in particular the driver and his wife.
Right.
With Eileen Wuornos, again, you seem very, very attached. And with this film, how do you deal with that anger, the ethical problems that you might face? How do you turn off at night when you stop filming?
Well, I have to say, I found myself much more upset than I imagined when Eileen was executed. It was emotionally very difficult for me to deal with it. much more than I imagined. I mean, I thought I decided not to go into the execution because I just felt there was something I didn't want to witness and see. Always felt Jeb Bush should go in. But I think it was just the vindictiveness of the system and the sadism of the guards and that whole, I actually studied law before I became a documentary filmmaker, so it was very disillusioning to see what was happening and that she was so poorly represented, I think. But in the main, I haven't really, I felt on this film that I was, that I made friends with people that I really admired. And on the whole, I've got a lot more out of making these films, I think, than what I've given up, So I haven't found it an exhausting situation. I've got a lot of friends, I guess, that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I think that's really how I think about it. I mean, yes, they can be tiring, and lugging the equipment around is tiring, and doing the interviews is a bit exhausting, but it's kind of worth it, I think. I mean, you must find the same thing, when you did your films.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth it in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a very, you have a very privileged life because going into all these amazing worlds that you wouldn't normally see. So it's kind of like you're constantly getting this incredible education that you wouldn't have, and
I mean, it's exhausting, but I also enjoy the way you explain that. I also enjoy interviewing, and I also prefer to take the first interview on camera, because what Nick said is absolutely true. When people are asked, especially marginalized people, when they're asked something that nobody has ever bothered, it's just simple as that, nobody has ever bothered to ask them that question. And then you take the camera to them and ask them that question, the first response is just amazing. And even if you, the worst part is if something goes wrong at the time and you try to recreate it, it never happens in the same way. And I agree with you absolutely about that. I think we have to end the session. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Nick. It was fantastic having you here.
And to the wonderful new film centre that Ian's going to be setting up.
I just want to end, obviously, by thanking Nick and Geeta for stimulating a fantastic discussion, but also to say that I think you're too modest about this. You go into places and make films which are, many of us would think twice about. Facing up to Eugene Terre-Blanche, going to, LA and investigating the life of a serial killer, then going to China. I mean, so the element of kind of putting yourself out there, I don't think people sometimes acknowledge how important or how brave actually that is. I mean, and it kind of reminded me of how we met each other, because I just tell this very quickly, the story of how we met. It was about maybe 10 or 11 years ago. Geeta had founded the Brighton International Film Society and had a program of films and documentaries, and I was helping her out. And we got a call one day from a production assistant working for Nick, who said that there's a Nick Broomfield that wants to join your film society. So we kind of thought, really? Well, there must be more to it than that. I mean, the Nick Broomfield, the filmmaker Nick Broomfield wants to join your film society. So we kind of said, well, there's obviously more to it than that. And indeed, the production assistant came round to our place and talked to us and said he needed 5 membership cards, because Nick was just about to go to China to do some filming, which would be kind of undercover, illegal filming for that film about the Chinese cockle pickers that perished in Morecambe Bay. And he needed an alibi should the Chinese authorities kind of spot him and his crew kind of filming, and he basically, the alibi was that we are film buffs and we're a member of a film society. So again, putting himself out there and in danger. And of course we said, yes, you can join the Brighton International Film Society, but on one condition, that you come back and you show us a film, and it was A Big White Self, I think, that you showed, and you do a Q&A for us, and so that was about 10 years ago. So it's fantastic, you know, that we kind of we're still in touch, and we've managed to bring you up to Newcastle for the first time. Hopefully it won't be for the last time. We'll bring you up again to talk about other films and to have further interactions. But yeah, thank you so much for coming up and inaugurating the Film Practices series. Thank you very much.